You know, when I was invited by Dimitri to introduce Senator Rand Paul this evening, and I looked at his biographical materials, the first thing that struck me, I guess it's inevitable, is his relative youth. He was born in 1963. Of course, that's 1 year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and 1 year before Barry Goldwater was decisively defeated by Lyndon Johnson in the presidential election. Now, Senator, you probably don't remember that election, but I do. As a member of the Young Americans for Freedom in Salt Lake City, Utah, I was bitterly disappointed. While Senator Paul pursued a career in medicine, graduating from the Duke Medical School, politics of the Republican and Libertarian stripe, of course, ran in the Paul family. And in 1994, he founded the Kentucky Taxpayers United, a group that tracked tax and spending issues in the state. For over a decade, of course, he remained involved in these issues as his father's presidential campaigns generated a passionate following, laying the groundwork for the emergence of the Tea Party later. Indeed, on the 236th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party in 2009, Senator Paul announced his candidacy for the U.S. Senate for Kentucky, and in 2010 he was elected to the Senate, and needless to say has quickly risen to national prominence. Unlike many of his colleagues, Senator Paul has not shied away from foreign affairs and national security, and in the process has brought some fresh thinking into what has been a tired and sterile debate on these issues on Capitol Hill. He, of course, received a lot of media attention earlier this year when he staged a 13-hour filibuster on the Senate floor when he strongly objected to elements of the administration's policy on drones. But what really seized my attention, and I can say others at the center, was not his filibuster speech, but another underreported speech last year delivered to the Heritage Foundation, in which he outlined a foreign policy vision based on many traditional conservative concepts, based, I think, or embodied by George Kennan, in which he outlined a foreign policy vision in which the United States could avoid continual conflict and open-ended commitments. Allow me, if you will, to finish my introduction of Senator Paul by quoting a small passage from that speech. In fact, it's his opening remarks in that speech where he says, "Foreign policy is uniquely an arena where we should base decisions on the landscape of the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. I see the world as it is. I am a realist, not a neoconservative, nor an isolationist." Senator Paul, I think you've grabbed our attention, and I welcome you to approach the podium.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I've just been here a couple years, and I remember when I was first elected, John McCain called me on the phone, and he said, you know, the first 6 months you're up there, you'll pinch yourself and you'll say, how did I get here amongst all these really important people? And then the next 6 months you'll pinch yourself and say, how the hell did the rest of these guys get up here? I'm in my second 6 months. I'm in the how the hell did the rest of them get up here now. I have to admit, my first experience with Richard Nixon, my first encounter, wasn't a good one. I was 9, and his speeches on TV were just a little too long and a little too dry for a 9-year-old. So for a 9-year-old, Richard Nixon's sort of something that grows on you. Now, when I was about 10 years old, I used to play chess with this old Ukrainian guy. His name was Pete Karpenko. And Captain Pete's what we called him. He told us stories about fighting the Bolsheviks when he was 14 years old. I don't know how the guy was, I don't know how he was still alive. He was still fighting when he was 14 years old. But you know what? He had been a peasant in the Ukraine, and he wasn't rich, he wasn't royalty, but he fought with the Tsar because they resisted the idea of collective farming. He fought against them, and he fled when the communists won. 55 years later, though, he was still afraid to go back home. He never returned to the Soviet Union. So it's easy to understand that around my household, we didn't have much use for communists or sympathizers. Like so many conservatives of the middle class in the 1970s, our inclination was to resist anything to do with communism, anything to do with Red China. In that black and white world, you were either for us or you were against us. Trade with China was thought to be trade with the enemy. A funny thing, though, happened along the way. Many conservatives came to understand a larger truth. As trade began to blossom with China, many conservatives, myself included, now I'm I think 10 or 11, so I'm really getting mature in my foreign policy views, came to admit, though, that trade improves our economic well-being and makes us less likely to fight. The success of trade with China, I think, made many conservatives rethink their view of the world. People sometimes ask me, what is my worldview? My response is that, even if you've crisscrossed the globe, even if you've been everywhere, I'm just not sure that the world doesn't change by the time you return to the same spot twice. I am a believer that foreign policy must be viewed by events as they present themselves, not as we wish them to be. A few years ago, I read John Gaddis's biography of George Kennan, and it amazed me. I remember reading the review, and this is sort of what got me interested in it because I thought it was somewhat humorous. I laughed and I said, they said, Dr. Gaddis promised Kennan. He says, we're not going to publish it until you die. Kennan lived, and he lived, and he lived. 20 years later, Gaddis's students were jokingly wondering who would die first, and he still hadn't published the biography. But I love the book. To me, I think containment is not a dead letter. I look at the worldwide menace of radical jihad, and I think we need a long-term vigilance like containment. Kennan believed that there's a distinction between vital and peripheral interests. I couldn't agree more. Politicians vaguely understand that they must assert a national security interest before launching war. But asserting a national security interest doesn't necessarily make it so. To me, the assertion of a vital interest is the beginning of the debate, not the end of the debate. When the president came to us to try to convince us in the Senate to support a military strike in Syria, he acknowledged that the national security interest was at best ambiguous. Because of the demand by many of us for more debate, a diplomatic solution arose that may well do something that no military response could have ever achieved. That's remove the chemical weapons. The Syrian chemical weapons solution, the idea that negotiation can improve our world, is something we need to address in the standoff with Iran and North Korea. I think by leveraging our relationship with China, we should be able to influence the behavior of North Korea, and I think we already are. Likewise, I think we should be engaging the Russians to assist us with the Syrians and the Iranians. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates has been in the news a lot lately with his new book. I liked this quote from the book. He says, in recent decades, presidents confronted tough problems. They've confronted these tough problems abroad, but they've been too often too quick to reach for a gun. Our foreign policy and our national security policy has become too militarized. The use of force too easy for presidents. Coming from a lifelong military man, I think this is a great response. Last year, I was appointed to the Foreign Affairs Committee. I like foreign policy, especially the name-calling. It seems everybody's got a name for themselves. And you know what? Even nastier names for their opponents. So we've got neocons, we've got realists, we've got hawks, we've got doves, we've got isolationists, we've got globalists and idealists. Seems the only thing for certain is if you don't label yourself first, your enemies will. I do, though, think that the world of foreign policy has been somewhat turned on its head in the past decade. Neoconservatives brag of their desire for engagement, but increasingly preach a doctrine that is hostile to diplomatic engagement. To this crowd, everyone that doesn't agree with them is the next Chamberlain. Doesn't make for a very intelligent debate. To this crowd, anyone who doesn't clamor first for the military option is somehow an isolationist. The irony is that the crowd that claims they want to engage often opposes diplomatic engagement. The irony is that this crowd that wants to project power does it from inside an echo chamber that isolates itself from negotiation because foreigners aren't to be trusted. The school of thought that beats its chest and seeks to spread worldwide enlightenment now promotes not a neoconservatism, but a neo-isolationism, in which diplomacy is distrusted and war is, if not the first choice, the preferred option. All right, so this is a bit of a characterization. But I believe the answers to most problems that confront us around the world can and should be approached by engaging, both friend and foe. You know, I'm not naive enough to say that dialogue's always going to work or that we should always believe what people are telling us, but I also think we should avoid the rigidity of saying that dialogue never works. I believe we should approach diplomacy from the notion that dialogue is nearly always preferable to war, but that potential enemies should never mistake, as Reagan put it, our reluctance for war with a lack of resolve. Our response to 9/11 should disabuse any potential enemies of the belief that America is to be trifled with. In the end, to me, though, diplomacy is similar to a market transaction. Market transactions are never equal. If I give you $2 for a loaf of bread, it's only because I value the loaf of bread more than the $2, and you value the $2 more than the bread. Exchange occurs when each party believes that they have gotten the better of the bargain. Now, this may not be no great insight to famous diplomats and foreign policy experts, but to me, I think it's the beginning of understanding diplomacy, the beginning of understanding problem resolution. To me, it's the first principle of diplomacy, understanding that diplomacy is only successful when both parties feel that they have won. In order for both parties to perceive victory, I think both parties need to save face, or at the very least, not lose face. Saving face is even more important if one party in the transaction is a superpower and the other party is a second or third tier country. The Chinese have finessed the concept of saving face to such a degree that they have 3 words for saving face and probably 20 different permutations. To me, saving face is similar to what Sun Tzu wrote about leaving your enemy and escape. Tzu wrote, "To a surrounded enemy, you must leave a way of escape." I would add that to a surrounded enemy, you must leave a way of saving face. If you insist on unconditional surrender as a prerequisite for diplomacy, there will be very little diplomacy. William Ury describes leaving an exit as an integral facet of wielding power. He writes, "Superior power is useless if it drives your opponent into a corner and makes him resist you with all his might. Leaving him a way out is a time-honored precept." Short of unconditional defeat of the enemy, both sides must recognize that the problem resolution comes when both sides perceive victory and both sides save face. The technological ease of war, though, I think has dulled our sensibility to be statesmen. Karl Marlantes was a decorated Vietnam combat veteran, and he says that the great deficiency of legislators is their inability to make decisions as if they themselves were the warrior on the ground on the receiving end of mortar blasts. There certainly is a time for war, but the threshold should be high and the cause clear. Colin Powell was fond of saying that war should be the politics of last resort. We should have a purpose our people understand and support. When America is attacked, our interests directly threatened, our country should and will defend itself with the force and authority of our collective will. We will seek no other military objective than complete victory over our attackers. I doubt I've presented any new insight to this august body, something that no one hasn't heard already. I also hope I haven't insulted anyone, or hopefully not too many people, with a physician's thoughts on diplomacy. Someone once said there are no new ideas, there are only ideas that are new to you. Thank you for allowing me to come this evening, and if nothing else, I want you to know that I consider foreign policy to be an unending process of learning, that I'm very open to learning new ideas, whether they are indeed new or just new to me. Thank you very much.
I first of all want to thank myself because we're only 10 minutes over our promised end at 9 o'clock. But I think that we've accomplished our objective tonight. I said in my introductory remarks that where the center achieves its real impact is not in terms of its size, not in terms of its number of programs, but as thought leaders. And I think both in terms of representing maybe the past, in terms of the people who have spoken here tonight from previous successful administrations, but also looking towards the future in the remarks we've just heard from Senator Rand Paul. I think we've actually fulfilled that mission of being thought leaders at a time when I think that the balance of power in terms of the foreign policy debate in this town is changing. And that's because of many of the strong, assertive personalities that are in this room and particularly are at the center. And one thing I neglected to do tonight, and I will do it before we end, is credit also another individual at the center who hasn't been mentioned tonight, and that's Paul Saunders, who has the unenviable task of keeping all these high-octane egos in check. But I want to conclude our dinner tonight. It was an important anniversary for the center. It's at a time of, I think, great success for the institution, and it's at a time when, as Chuck Boyd is taking on his new chairmanship, we want to remind you of the importance of the pen. Thank you very much.